Thank you so much for being here, man.
Thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Yes, I'm super excited for this conversation. This channel has been kind of brewing in the background for actually like 10 years, but in actuality, like 6 months. And as soon as I thought about, okay, maybe this is how it could come together, you were one of the first people who came to my mind. And so this is just an excuse for me to talk to you, actually.
I'm honored. Yeah, I mean, I always am happy for an excuse to talk to you as well outside the Ukrainian bathhouses that we frequent,
That's right.
So
That's right.
we are.
You are a dear Dharma brother and friend to me. But for listeners who don't know you, you're kind of an interesting guy. You're currently working at Harvard University Divinity School. What do you do there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So my full title is a bit of a mouthful. I'm the Multi-Religious Ministry Initiatives Coordinator. I think we need to come up with some kind of catchy acronym for that. But basically, I work in the Ministry Studies office at the Divinity School at Harvard, and my role there is to support students who are doing our master's programs who have come from backgrounds that haven't historically been represented in divinity schools. So folks from, for example, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, uh, Jewish, pagan, multi-belonging religious nuns, those who don't identify with any tradition. And in particular, I do a lot of work managing the Buddhist Ministry Initiative right now, which is a whole set of programs for training folks who are interested in Buddhist spiritual care, Sangha leadership, things like that. So it's never boring. Yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff I get to do.
So you're at HDS right now. You're doing all this really cool work in the Buddhist Ministry Initiative, and your background in your what did you study in undergrad? How did you get to doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, it was not a linear path. Yeah, so in undergrad, so I'll just start out by saying that I grew up in a Tibetan Buddhist household, Tibetan, part of the Sanghas around here in the Boston area, the Buddhist communities here in the Boston area, and based in Nepal too. So I always kind of had a background interest and practice in Buddhism, but in undergrad, actually, I started out not really being that academically interested in it. So I did political science, international studies, and actually Islamic studies. I was just really fascinated with the Middle East and Islam as religion and how it's practiced on the ground. And so I did a lot of work with that and studied in Morocco and Kuwait and places like that. Um, and then in graduate school is when I started becoming really interested in Buddhist studies academically, as well as in my personal practice, and sort of did some comparative work there as well. So, yeah, you never know where you'll end up.
Mm.
Uh, yeah.
Would
Mhm.
you have thought that you would actually end up doing what you're doing now? Maybe like 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
No, no. So, yes, I'm kind of actually in an ideal scenario right now. So I feel very fortunate in that way. I really did not picture anything like this 10 years ago through my trajectory. I think I will say in the broader Buddhist world, this is one of the very few sorts of jobs that actually pays a living wage. And so I'm consider myself extraordinarily fortunate to have ended up in this sort of position. And also mostly just being in a position where I get to interact with and support so many wonderful students and practitioners of all sorts of backgrounds who are interested in these sorts of practices. That was always kind of a dream of mine that I really didn't know how it was going to look in the future, and just sort of took next steps here and there and ended up walking into something that really has worked out really well.
Mm.
So yeah, the karmic networks are interesting in a traditional Buddhist way of framing it.
Mm.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I love that, and I see that as well. What do you mean when you say that? The karmic networks. What is that?
Yeah, I think I've always been really taken. So in Buddhism, as you know, also Esteban, there's this idea of um, radical interconnection and interdependence, where uh, the idea of an individual and individual action and uh, the ego in isolation is also kind of an illusion. And so the idea is we're all actually radically interconnected, and everything we do has causes and effects that come from a while before and interact with other causes and conditions that are happening all around us with other beings. And I think for me, that's unfolded in a lot of interesting ways in my life unexpectedly, where I've seen some circumstance come up and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll take a step in that direction and see where that leads me. And that precipitates something else. And so, that old kind of trite expression, like when one door closes, another opens, but I find that's quite true in
Mm,
a sense of karmic causality,
mm,
sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, but it is what it is in either case. So I found that to be a really helpful sort of way of kind of taking some of the pressure off of myself, quote unquote, in my life trajectory to sort of just do my best, take the next step within this wider web of interconnection that's going on.
totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
and my experience is that as our practice deepens, and I remember, Ethan Nichtern?
Yes.
So I practiced with Ethan for a couple of years, and I remember him once saying that like the more we practice, the more intuitive our practice becomes, and like the less cerebral and cognitive. And it just makes me think of like the timing of things sometimes. And as our practice starts to bring fruition, it's like all of a sudden we're like meeting people that we precisely should be meeting at this time, or encountering a book that we're precisely should be encountering at that time. And it becomes, I almost imagine like wormholes kind of opening up where you get to just like instead of take the road like up the mountain and then through, it's like a tunnel kind of opens up and then you find yourself on the other side and you're like, well, okay, auspicious circumstances. That's what they call them, right?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, I like that framing the wormholes. It's sort of like a Star Trek way of looking at it. I'll have to keep that in mind
Yes.
going
And
forward.
which is right in line with we have the right, so we do like a men's sauna group, monthly group, and then we have a
Hmm.
group of Dharma practitioners that we endearingly have called the Dharma dorks. And we
Hmm.
are quite an irreverent bunch who are very likely to make like smutty references and quote Star Trek at various different times.
This is true.
And that's kind of part of what's really exciting to me about this channel is I think we have kind of a cultural idea of like what it means to be Buddhist, what it means to be a Dharma practitioner. Um, but my experience in interacting with a whole swath of different generations of practitioners is that it actually can look like a lot of different things.
Hmm. Hmm. That's definitely true. And I think one of the beautiful things about our Sangha, our Buddhist community that we're in with our teachers and our lineage in Tibetan Buddhism is that when we visit our home monastery in Nepal, for example, we get to learn from our really wise, like, um, Amas are the elderly Tibetan women who show up at all the teachings and meditation practices, and we get to sit with them. We get to meet with like the old hippies who ended up there or here,
Mm,
who got into it along the way, and who all have their own stories. Um, we have Nepali folks. We have young people from like elite Western universities like Brown, Harvard. We have more working class folks who have found their way in one way or another, all different backgrounds. So, yeah, and I think uh, nobody, I think, takes themselves too seriously, or at least that's the idea, hopefully. That we don't take ourselves too seriously, but we take the practice seriously. So
mm,
that's a nice
mm.
sort of balance, I think. Yeah.
Oh man, I love that. We don't take
Hmm.
ourselves. That'll be on the shirts we make. We're not quite sure that we don't take ourselves. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I'm sure we could market those
Totally. Then we
to
can make a
some.
bunch of money because that's what this is about.
Yeah, it's all about the dollar bills, as
All
they
those
say.
that's about the dollar bills, man. Well,
Yeah.
what's really cool to me is that, for people who don't have exposure to Buddhist practice, to Dharma, it's actually a really recent phenomenon in the West, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, basically after the Tibetan exile in the 1960s, after the Chinese Communist Party invaded, all these Rinpoches, all these lamas, all these Tibetan practitioners, kind of the analogy that I think of often is like a dandelion, right? They just like blew on it and spread all over the world, and then essentially like our teachers are the first generation of translator practitioners, right? Where like they studied and they learned, or our parents, right? In your case,
Mm.
like the first generation of practitioners who learned directly in Tibetan maybe and practicing with Rinpoches who maybe like barely speak English. And then we are kind of the second generation. And then there's a third generation that it's really cool to see. You talk about those young Brown and Harvard kids. It's like looking at the next crop in the harvest of like, wow, interesting. Like y'all have a lot more kind of indigeneity in your Dharma practice. It's a lot more kind of baked in to your language and your worldview compared to kind of the translation process that our parents and our teachers and even us kind of have to undergo a little bit as we try to wrap our heads around what are we even talking about.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's true. And yeah, I think the question of indigeneity is really interesting here in that um, obviously we have to respect the tradition and the communal situatedness and ethical background that these practices come from, and their Tibetan, their Asian origin, and all of this, and lineage is so important in that case. Um, and at the same time, it is the case that Buddhism has always moved from place to place and adapted to different cultures. And so, um, as you're bringing up indigeneity, like I've been really inspired to see what some of the younger folks in the community have been doing in terms of respecting that tradition and authenticity in really authentic ways and sort of decolonial ways, while also embodying the tradition in new ways in like an American cultural
Mm,
context.
mm.
And so that balancing act, I think, can be really challenging. But I think I've been really inspired more and more these days to see how people are achieving it in new ways, um, and keeping the different parts of our community in touch and together around that is really great to see. Um, yeah, I was at our intensive retreat recently in one of our centers in California and learned a whole bunch of new Gen Alpha slang from a couple people there
Like
that
Dharma
that
slang,
we no, just like,
just regular slang.
just regular slang that I as a geriatric millennial now did not know. But of course, we immediately started using it in Dharmic context.
Like
So you
what?
never
Like
know.
what? What's the give me the scoop, man. I'm not plugged into
Um,
the vibes.
Okay. Well, I'm behind the curve. Apparently, this is already out of vogue now, but the whole six
Oh,
seven thing,
6, 7, yeah.
that 6, 7, you know,
That's like how many
sk
eons it takes for us to awaken fully, right? 6, 7 eons,
exactly
something like that.
around 6, 7,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, Skibbity toilet, which is apparently meaningless, but there is something very dharmic about just saying something that has no cognitive meaning
Mm.
and putting it out there into the void and seeing what happens, you
Huh.
know? So you
Maybe
never know
help
what'll
us
happen.
shake us into non-conceptual awareness. Skibbity toilet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right, like a koan, skibbity toilet, boom. So this sort of intergenerational pollination. Yeah, you never know. You never know what'll happen with it.
Well, that's really interesting. So one of the things that I was worried about, I'm going to be honest with you, I
Hmm.
was worried about us talking because I already in my mind have like 6 different parallel universe conversations we could be having, like so many different
Hmm.
boxes we could open up. And maybe that means we have to have more of these talks.
Hmm.
But I kind of want to go back to something because you've mentioned this a couple of times, or it's come up a couple of times, this intergenerational quality of practice. You
Hmm.
are in a pretty rare situation where you are kind of a Western American that was raised in Tibetan Buddhist practice. Would you say that's true?
Hmm. True. Yeah, I think there's a few of us out there now. I think the colloquial term is Dharma brats. Yeah, who were
Dharma
raised second
brats. You
generation.
are
Yeah,
a self-described Dharma brats. Yes.
indeed. Or as my friend Leela and recently coined, Dharma nepo babies. Yeah, exactly.
So how did you
Uh,
come to be a Dharma Nepo baby?
Good question. So, my parents were part of that generation that you were describing of Westerners in the 70s and 80s who uh, became really interested in the Dharma through different avenues. And in my parents' case, they um, spent a bunch of time in the Peace Corps in the Philippines.
Hmm.
And following that, my dad always was really interested in um, theories of the mind and cognition. He did you know neuroscience and molecular biochemistry in his undergrad days because he was curious about that from a scientific perspective. Um, but they just became increasingly interested in Buddhism at that time, and they ended up living in India for quite a while, in Nepal, and the Tibetan refugee communities there who had settled in different parts of India following the Chinese invasion of Tibet, as you were mentioning. And my mom had some healthcare training, so she sort of served as a nurse in these monastic communities, and my dad did some very traditional monastic style training there, and learned at the feet of all of these great masters of the time. Some listeners might be familiar with folks like Tulku Khyentse Rinpoche, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, Gelug masters as well. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, they met a couple times. So it was really kind of unique background for folks at that time to spend so much time immersed in that community. And then my dad ended up over the years getting ordained as a lama, which it translates to basically like teacher. So he's authorized to teach and lead sessions in the Tibetan tradition. And so it was sort of like growing up being the preacher's kid in a sense, except in a
Mm,
Buddhist context, which was very unusual for a white kid from the suburbs of Massachusetts.
mm.
But yeah, it was a good set of tools to have in the toolbox growing up, for sure. Definitely.
How was that for you growing up as the white Buddhist kid? I don't think there was probably many like white Buddhist club, like what was that like for you?
That's true. Yeah. I remember having some conversations with my friends when I was in elementary school. And, growing up outside Boston, in my town, most people were either Catholic or Jewish.
Hmm.
And, so everyone would go to either CCD, like Catholic education, one day a week, or they go to Hebrew school one day a week. And I remember one kid at one point who I was semi friends with in elementary school came up to me and he was like, "Hey man, like, you should really be going to CCD because if you don't, you might end up in hell."
Ooh,
And he meant really well by that because he was like legitimately concerned
he's looking after you,
that,
dude. He's looking
yeah,
after you.
exactly, which I appreciated. I recognized that at the time, but I also knew at the time that I was like not, I was just different and kind of had a different worldview.
Hmm.
And um, but for the most part, I think it was just really a good set of supports to have. And, um, and many of the folks in our song I've known since I was a kid. And it sort of is nice to have that community of elders, like we're saying, back to this intergenerational theme, like to have been immersed in that community as a kid and have that field of care, um, sort of a sense of, being part of a loving, wise community that way. Yeah. Hmm.
Totally. Man, I feel like a sadness or an aching in myself when I hear you describe this in thinking
Hmm.
about my son, right? So Alejandro, have you met Ale?
I think a couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so you
Good
met Ale.
kid.
So
Yeah.
he's 9, right? Yeah, he's a good kid.
Hmm.
And so, I'm a Buddhist practitioner, I'm a yogi, his mom is a yogi. And I often will just have this feeling of like there's no place for us to go, is how it feels to me, right? Like if you're a Christian, you go to church. If you're Jewish, you go to synagogue, you can go to a mosque if you're Muslim. But like if you're a Dharma practitioner, if you're a contemporary Buddhist practitioner, there's like centers, right? There's like the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, there's the Barry Insight Meditation Center, there's Vipassana, but it's all like for the most part like pretty formal, intense kind of environments where there's adult practitioners, and there's really not, as far as I know, the sense of community, right? Where like you show up every Sunday, you show up every Saturday, and you go through essentially mass, right? Like you spend time, you connect with other community members. So it both makes me super happy for you to hear that you've had that experience in your life and how rich and nourishing that must be, and also just kind of sad for my kid who we're raising like Buddhist, right? Like he knows the
Hmm.
things, but we're not pushing it on him. But it would be so great to have like a place to go to, a community, a church of some kind, you know?
Hmm. I've thought about that a lot, actually, because we have our centers that we can go to for retreats sometimes. Of course, as you're saying, that's not always kid friendly to like take a flight up there and like, there's not always childcare available. And so how much of the sessions you're actually gonna be able to go to if you're also taking care of a kid, and is the kid, is Ale going to have fun there? Um,
Totally.
and yeah, I think a lot of sanghas in the West haven't quite figured out this balance of like how to have a healthy sort of familial atmosphere where it's not just like adults intensely practicing in an austere way the whole time. And, and not to harp on this too much because, this is true in many contexts, but I think that is partly a product of some, not all, but some Western sanghas trying really hard to find some kind of like quote unquote essential or true Buddhism, and
Mm,
trying to lean really hard into like, meditative practice, intense, like, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like intense meditative practice is wonderful, of course, and it should be encouraged. But, if you go to like temples in Nepal or Bhutan or India, um, you'll see kids all over the place. You'll see families there, showing up for empowerment so the kids can also get the blessings from the teachers. And so I think, there's differences between like lived Buddhism in these sorts of communities and like sort of idealized Buddhism that isn't necessarily how it's been practiced through the years. And so I think we in Western countries still have a lot of progress to go in terms of fostering a welcoming environment, and sort of breaking through some of those like sometimes Orientalist ways that we view it of like this like hermit austere practice that we have to keep pure.
totally. I mean,
Yeah.
we kind of fetishize it a little bit, right?
Hmm.
This is a territory of conversation that is so interesting to me, and because
Hmm.
I totally see what you're describing, and it's something that I think about all the time. But then the flip side of it is also like I have heard one of our shared teachers, Choki Nyima Rinpoche, and I think the
Hmm.
Dalai Lama also talking about how for many Tibetan practitioners, actually the Dharma teachings themselves have kind of eroded a little bit. I've heard
Hmm.
Choki Nyima say like Western practitioners are actually like know more about the Dharma than like Tibetan practitioners because what we've
Hmm.
extracted is really like the practices without the culture. And what you're describing is kind of like, maybe you go to church and you kind of go through the movements and it's been in your generation and it gives you a community, but are you really sort of like wholeheartedly praying to Jesus Christ in the morning? Like maybe,
Hmm.
maybe not, right? So the flip
Hmm.
side of it being how it can also become sort of this cultural thing that is actually
Hmm.
now a little bit watered down from like they don't know what the Madhyamaka Karika is, like
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's a difficult balance to strike, I think. And it's true. I've heard Chogyam Rinpoche say that before too. And yeah, I think ultimately, Buddhism loves to talk about the middle way. Maybe we have to find a middle way here between family life and not being too uptight and strict about stuff, and also like really authentically learning and practicing in a way that makes sense for us. Yeah.
Hmm,
you know I guess we're all still looking for that middle way here as we start to mature, as Buddhism starts to mature more here, in predominantly white Western communities. um,
hmm,
and Yeah, and I think we also have a lot to learn also from our Asian American communities here in the U.S. who have been practicing Buddhism for longer than we have, like the Japanese American community in California, for example, with the Shin Buddhist churches there. It's been really inspirational to me in terms of how they've structured it.
hmm.
They've been there over 100 years now. Chinese American community and their temples, and Vietnamese temples. I've been to a couple here in the Boston area who are really amazing and do really great work in communities. So I think the more kind of um, learning we can do together as a community from those who have some experience, I think could be really beneficial for us. Yeah.
Totally. Do you think that that is, I mean, because really, like, okay, little quick history lesson for people who aren't total Dharma nerds like us. Like,
Yeah.
um, okay, tell me why the year 1959 was significant for the nation of Tibet.
Yes. So the year 1959 is when the um, CCP, the military, took over Tibet completely, and deposed the Dalai Lama and imposed their own government upon Tibet, and basically colonized Tibet and made it now part of modern China as a geopolitical entity. The initial invasion started in 1949, so it was sort of a 10-year process. 1959 is when they formally deposed Dalai Lama and he fled. And there was an uprising in Lhasa that helped basically cover his escape, along with a bunch of his government and senior teachers to India, and it was an extraordinarily dangerous process for them fleeing the country, and a number of teachers, great teachers, were killed or sent to jail or gulags as part of that. So, at that point, of course, it was a horrific tragedy, and thousands of Dharma texts were destroyed, and temples and statues were destroyed, and basically, the start of a cultural genocide that's still happening today. You hear stories about Tibetan children being sent to government schools, and it sounds like they've learned a lot from our history in terms of how we sort of did a cultural genocide on the Native Americans here, refusing them instruction in their own language, their own spiritual tradition, their own history, being turned into model Han Chinese citizens. Um, so, of course, a horrific, horrific tragedy on an unimaginable scale. At the same time, that was the start of a period where Tibetan Buddhism went into exile into India, Nepal, Bhutan, places like that, and from there spread to all sorts of other countries throughout the world, throughout Asia, throughout the West, Africa now too, South America, Central America. There's a bunch of sites in Mexico too now, teachers there. And so while it was a horrific tragedy for the Tibetans, it was also the start of a really influential period of Tibetan Buddhism going into diaspora and really spreading, and people
Mhm.
from all over the world being able to connect with the teachings in a really new and authentic way. And so, in that sense, it was an enormous gift
Hmm.
to us who may never have encountered the teachings in this way without that diaspora.
Hmm.
So a mixed bag for sure, but we'll see where it goes in the next few decades. It's not looking great right now politically,
Yeah.
but yeah, definitely.
And so appropriate, right? Because the heart, in my experience, the heart of Dharma, the heart of Buddhism is to take suffering and come out of it or make it meaningful, right? Yeah. And
Hmm.
the fact that this horrible tragedy actually became a gift to all of us now who benefit from the teachings at the at enormous cost to the Tibetan people is
Hmm.
something to feel complexity around.
Indeed, indeed, and I think yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Feeling the complexity, and I think that's why, in my mind anyway, it's so important for me and as part of the tradition to really, really place a lot of value on lineage and our spiritual ancestors and
Mm,
where it comes from, and the enormous suffering and sacrifices that our teachers have been through to disseminate these teachings and save as many texts as they could. And there's stories of monks and teachers and nuns grabbing as many texts they could under their arms, and foregoing other supplies but taking Dharma texts with them because they knew that was the most precious thing. And so it almost brings me to tears to think about
me too,
sometimes,
man.
like, their devotion. And so I have an enormous amount of devotion to our Tibetan spiritual ancestors for that reason. Hmm.
Absolutely. And I've heard Chokinima and other Rinpoches talk a lot about language specifically
Hmm.
and Tibetan. And actually, I know Chokinima and Eric Pema Kunsang, who's in
Hmm.
Denmark, is that right?
Yes.
Eric
Hmm.
Pema Kunsang and many of the Tibetan teachers who are active nowadays are actually undergoing huge efforts to translate texts because I think
Hmm.
that there's this really kind of sad fact that they're pointing to that the Tibetan language is actually deeply endangered, right? So I went to the Dharma
Hmm.
house and I practiced there, and it was really fast in New York with Chokinima, and it was really interesting to notice how there was like these multi generations of Tibetans, and like two of the generations spoke Tibetan fluently, natively, but then the younger ones were like Tibetan American, and they didn't have a connection with the language as much. And he was very adamant about we need to preserve the language. But I think that a lot of the Rinpoches are preparing just in case by undergoing these like huge translation efforts. And I'll post some of the links that there's like 84,000.org and other
Hmm.
organizations that are just like volunteer run, basically people
Hmm.
putting all of this effort to translate and be able to recuperate and save these precious teachings that have come to us that are in danger.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, I think it's a problem that is the case for many sort of indigenous languages like this that have
Yeah,
undergone colonization. And so, yeah, the Tibetan language is no exception to that, unfortunately. And you're right. I've been enormously inspired to see all of the resources going to translation projects now, and also for Tibetan language classes, I think that are becoming, I don't know how popular they are, in terms statistically, but um, more and more accessibility for folks who would like to learn Tibetan. I think there's more programs like that out there now. So, while it remains endangered and the Chinese government is doing its best to suppress it within Tibet itself, I think there is hope in the diaspora and all these sorts of translation projects that are going on. And many of these texts have never been translated outside of Pali or Sanskrit or classical Tibetan or classical Chinese. And so it's really exciting to see them sort of disseminated in many different languages now so that anyone can connect. Yeah.
I mean, it's just a
Mm.
treasure trove, right? I mean, a lot of these teachings have been held very closely, right, in like monasteries or environments where very few people have access to them. And now they're all of a sudden meeting like AI and Google and translation
Mhm.
services and people in everywhere in the world. And it's like, it's almost like this treasure trove of the fruits of practice. And people just kind of scribble things down. And like 700 years later, they had no idea somebody on an iPhone would be like, oh, wow, a new sutra. Like, that's crazy to me.
It's true. Yeah. Like I have the 84,000 app on my phone
Oh, I
and the
don't.
translate. And sometimes I'll just like, oh, I'm on the bus. Like I'm
Oh my
bored.
God.
Instead of scrolling Reddit, maybe I'll look at a sutra that they just, so yeah, it's like wild how accessible it is. And, um, if we all read more sutras on the 84,000 app instead of, scrolling through Instagram, maybe the world would be a more peaceful place. I don't know.
I'm just laughing in my head, man. I'm imagining you on the bus and everybody's on Instagram and you're like 84,000. You're reading these sutras. Like,
Yeah, I don't want to sound too virtuous because it doesn't happen as often as it should,
yeah,
but
right. Well, of
but
course, it never
but
does.
yeah, that's true. But yeah, you'll just subtly flash the phone around so people get curious or something.
A little
We'll see.
exposure, liberation upon
Exactly.
seeing. That's a little Buddhist joke. Um,
Exactly.
the thing that's really interesting to me about Tibetan in particular, like, okay,
Hmm.
so there was the yeah, like late 1940s into late 1950s Chinese communist invasion, which they uh, formulate as an annexation, right, of territory that's rightfully
Hmm.
theirs, which the Tibetan people sort of vehemently disagree with. Um,
Hmm.
but what's interesting about the Tibetan language itself?
Yeah, that's a really rich question, and there are folks much more qualified than I am out there to go into it.
Mm,
But just from my own personal experience, so I took a few years of classical Tibetan as part of my grad education, and have picked some up over the years in Dharmic circles too. And um, I should point out classical Tibetan as the written and Dharmic scriptural language is different from colloquial Tibetan, like modern spoken Tibetan, and which I have less experience in, but I would like to have more experience in. Um, but classical Tibetan, it's just an enormously rich language that, in some senses, in its codified form now, was designed to communicate these kinds of dharmic ideas that we talk about that can't really be captured in translation. So, for example, if you read a line of Tibetan from a scripture or a namtar, a biographical account of a great practitioner, um, over time, you start to notice all these layers of meaning in every word
mm,
and every phrase
mm,
that can't really be captured in a translated form. So there's so many different senses of, what we in English would translate as mind, which just does not capture like, different levels of cognition, different levels of emotional involvement, nature of mind that isn't cognitive mind, but is like the ground from which cognition and emotion comes from. And it just there's no really way to capture it fully outside of its original, and there's so many great translators out there that are really doing an amazing job and have come really close, but it is like a dharmic language, and the words and syllables themselves really carry a lot of meaning and blessing, I think, just from
mm,
folks who have spent all of their lives practicing and reciting these same words. There's this idea of mantras and prayers carrying a lot of potency in the Tibetan language because so many great practitioners have recited them in Tibetan. Um, and so we get to touch in on those same blessings when we say
mm.
those words and prayers. And so the more we say them, that also means the more we say them in English, the more blessing we start to impart in them in English too. So sometimes I'll like switch it up and like, I do a practice where I say, it involves what's called the 21 praises to Tara, which is a pretty long prayer of the different emanations of the Buddha, Tara. And I'll recite it through in Tibetan, and then the next time I'll recite it through in English to like
Mm.
start getting
Just
more
plant
blessings in
seeds.
English.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Seed the
Exactly. Yeah,
blessings. Hmm.
exactly. So yeah, I highly recommend anyone who's kind of a language nerd or just really likes beauty, spiritual depth, to classical Tibetan, colloquial Tibetan, any Buddhist language can be fun to learn
Mm.
for that reason. Yeah.
It's
Hmm.
so interesting, right? I love thinking about language generally. I love thinking about how it applies to Dharma practice, right? Because something like a language that's based in ancient Greek or Latin is kind of a linear language. You have an alphabet, maybe
Hmm.
20 something letters, and you stick them together in different combinations, and they create a line that you can read the line. But Tibetan is different than that. And I studied Chinese for a while. I studied a little bit of Tibetan, but they're pictographic languages. So did you ever watch the
Hmm.
movie Arrival?
Yes,
About
I
the
love that
aliens with the
movie.
aliens. It's a great movie
Hmm.
about language, right? And
Hmm.
it's like I
Right.
kind of got that sense when you were talking a little bit. It's like these pictographic languages can communicate not just horizontally, but also vertically and diagonally, kind of, if that makes sense. They
Hmm.
have like a depth to them that linear language doesn't have. And I find, honestly, I oftentimes, and I think that this is, I kind of want to go back a little bit to talking about like why is it that Westerners are struggling to translate or to bring Dharma or to kind of start Dharma, temples or whatever that is. And I think that the English language really strains sometimes under the weight of trying to describe the experiences that Buddhist teachings are pointing to. And
Hmm.
the Tibetan language has this like richness, this ability to open that up and do that. And like you said, it's this granularity. It's like how many words for mind are there, right? Maybe like
Hmm.
85, I don't know. Like English is like the mind. It's like love. It's like I love the
Hmm.
sunset and my dog and my grandma and cake the same. It's like I love that TV show.
Hmm.
It's like, wow, we're so, it's almost like a kind of linguistic poverty. And I
Hmm.
wonder how it would be to enrich our language by taking a page from their book and seeing like how do we actually describe, they're so good at describing distinct units of experience in a way that we really don't.
Hmm.
It's very like broad strokes for us
Hmm.
sometimes.
It's true. It's true. I think you're right. I think, and I don't want to dunk too much on English because, of course, there's like, wonderful poetry and other strengths of it. But I think you're right.
Mm,
In this
mm,
context, it is, it's just not designed for it. It kind of developed in the Western Enlightenment model and the Cartesian sort of uh, philosophical dualism model, and so when you encounter a tradition that is explicitly trying to point at something that's non-dual and beyond cognitive experience, um, how do you sort of merge that that gap? It's pretty hard, and there's some skillful ways that folks have come up with to approach it, but sometimes it's easier to just keep the original Tibetan word for a
mm,
particular concept and sort of, finesse and learn the connotations of that word over time. I think we could learn a lot from these sort of these less linear languages, as you're saying. And I think there's a connection between language, linguistics, and theories of mind and theories of community as well. And so, um, if we adhere to sort of the regimented linear way of English or Romance languages, uh, in some ways that continues to uphold these ideas of like individualism and linear time and linear
mm,
thought. And so, not that we have to abandon the languages we grew up in, of course, but like bringing sort of problematizing that and bringing in these more like, um, uh, you know, less linear, more communally oriented, pointing at particular communal experiences, these types of languages, I think, could be quite useful for us to start to become acquainted with over time.
mm. And I think,
Yeah.
wow, man, this brings us back to the beginning of our conversation. Like, it's like language kind of becomes a metaphor, right?
Hmm.
For the whole process of bringing these practices and these lineages that come from a very specific cultural, linguistic, contextual lens. And then how do we translate that in a way that's both somehow simultaneously faithful and reverent of where it originated from, and also like fully embodied and representative of where we are and who and how we're practicing now. And language is
Hmm.
such a great example of that, right? Because
Hmm.
there's kind of two paths you can take, and probably the best is a middle way, like you said. But like, one is to try to figure out like how do we communicate the concept of samsara, right? Like how do we
Hmm.
come up with words that mean dharma, right? But like there's so
Hmm.
many connotations to it. So we're like, let's just import dharma and integrate it into our
Hmm.
language. But like, where's the line, right? Like where's the
Right.
line between we're going to take this term because it's just so nuanced and rich and it has like 2,500 years of history behind it to back it up, and where do we actually create our new language? And I think that's just such a great metaphor for how it is to try to figure out, especially only on Gen 3. We're on Gen 3. We're gonna have to keep incarnating on planet Earth to keep coming back to find out what's up with Dharma in like 500 years. That's crazy.
Yeah, the gift and burden of bodhisattva vows is keep
Yeesh.
reincarnating until
Ugh,
everyone gets free. It's
I
true.
don't know about
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I do also this is a really interesting line of conversation, and it's making me want to shout out folks in communities here in the U.S. and other places in the Americas in particular. I've noticed that um, have been really skilled at interfacing with Buddhist ideas and translating them into language that resonates with those communities, particularly Black Buddhist teachers like Lama Rod Owens or Dr. Pamela Ayoyatunde wrote a really great book called Casting Indra's Net, kind of in this vein that I think they're just extraordinarily skillful at um, illuminating how Buddhist ideas of interconnection and impermanence and emptiness, wisdom, compassion resonate with ideas that are indeed native or indigenous to folks who descend from enslaved Africans in the
Mm,
US or people who come from different indigenous communities here. And not that they're the same, we don't want to flatten them into being the same thing, but I think there is a lot of resonance there across these cultures that are more communally oriented and more wisdom tradition oriented, right here in our own kind of, geographical sphere that, for various uh, imperialistic and cultural reasons also get overlooked in a lot of predominantly white spaces. But I think there's a lot of room there for this sort of cross-cultural communication. We could learn a lot from folks like that too, who are doing that work. Yeah, I know I have at least continue to. Yeah. Hmm.
totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so exciting to me about Dharma practice is that like it's constantly alive. It's
Hmm.
constantly evolving and changing containers, right? I remember, I think Dzongkar Khyentse Rinpoche talking about how essentially the cultural context is just the cup and the Dharma is the water. And you're just pouring it
Hmm.
from cup to cup. It doesn't matter if it's a plastic sippy cup from McDonald's or a gold-studded like King's chalice. The water is actually
Hmm.
the same in it, and it's just so exciting to me that we do have such a diversity of. I mean, it's kind of the flip side, right? Because Dharma coming to the United States of America means it's going to encounter individualistic, capitalist, patriarchal paradigms, but it also means it's going to encounter enormous variety in terms of like
Hmm.
racial composition, ethnic composition, like like so many different um, routes that water can take to sprout something new. And I think that a lot of the teachers that I really respect and listen to nowadays are really like you said, they're not talking about Buddhism like this one thing, this monolithic kind of
Hmm.
monocrop thing. They're talking about plurality and multiplicity, and they're talking about how it's going to be like the only way forward is really for it to be sort of a garden that has all sorts of different stuff in it that you can't even imagine.
Hmm. I think that's true. And we've seen that like again getting into like Buddhist studies nerd territory that we
Mm.
that we like to nerd out about. But
We should have like
like
a
this
little
is
alarm. We should have like a little alarm bell. I can actually put that in post edit, just like "Beep, beep,
yeah.
beep, nerd alert." Okay, okay.
Nerd alarm. Yeah, air horn,
Air
something
horn.
like
Yes, I'll actually put it
that.
in. It'll be hilarious.
There, oh, please
Continue.
do.
Continue.
I'm excited to hear the finished product. But Buddhism, like many other religions, I think has shown this enormous level of adaptivity that we're talking about and
Mm,
flexibility as it's adapted to different cultures. And the migration of Buddhism out of India up through um, the Himalayas and into China, into Japan, Korea, and separately like down into Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Indonesia, like just the enormous diversity of Buddhist cultures that we see. It's like it's extraordinarily skillful at adapting to different cultures. And so I don't think we're any exception to that. And I think, there's a lot of diversity within our culture now too, as you said. And so there'll be a multiplicity of Buddhisms here, I think, as
Mm.
well, as has been the case in other countries. So I'm excited to see where it goes in the next few decades. Yeah. Whenever our next rebirths come around, maybe we'll see
We'll be there.
down the line. Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And interacting with other religions and other traditions here too.
Totally.
Yeah, it's an interesting time here in the US, as many of us are attuned to, but it's also an important time to get in touch with our spiritual grounding and spiritual base and see how it can help us to adapt to these times.
Mm, mm. Man, this is making me think about, and I think about this really often, but what it sounds like what we're describing is kind of a new Rime movement, right?
Mhm.
And again, nerd alert, burr, burr, like Rime, right, which is basically a movement, fairly recent movement, right, to unify all
Mhm.
the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and maybe we talk some other time about what those look like for listeners. But like the Rime movement, basically a handful of practitioners that really led the charge in finding the commonality between all the teachings, right? And it's like I get really hopeful and excited in a way that's almost painful when I imagine like, oh yes, like the multiplicity within Dharma and then the multiplicity within the Abrahamic lineages, and how would it be to exist, to kind of coexist in a world where all practices are revered because they are practice, right? It reminds me of like
Mhm.
the Dalai Lama, the stories of him like bowing to Virgin Mary, right? Like it's no different. She's a
Mhm.
bodhisattva, right? We were just talking about yesterday, like Jesus is a bodhisattva, right? Like there's so many different ways of contextualizing things.
It's true. And I think, yeah, I think, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other folks like that are really great models. I think of them as great models for me and for all of us in terms of folks who have gone really, really deep into their own particular lineage of practice, but that doesn't stop them from also engaging with other types of practice and respecting those types of practice. They've chosen their lineage and their tradition, but they don't let that stop them from engaging authentically with others. So, going deep without becoming fundamentalist and going broad without becoming deluded in your own practice, I think is a good model, hopefully.
We got another t-shirt, dude.
Yeah.
Going
There we
deep without
go.
becoming fundamentalist, broad without becoming diluted. Love that.
Exactly. Exactly.
So for you in your practice personally, like where is your, how should I say this? Like where is your attention in practice these days? Where has your practice brought you? What are you working with? What are you noticing in your mind? And where do you feel your practice kind of bringing you next?
Mm, this is a really rich question. Yes, I think I have been really feeling a lot of urgency around my practice recently. Not in like a, stressed out, like, yeah, like, sort of egoistic urgency, but more in like, I think with everything going on in our country and the broader world right now, and just in general, the place I am in life, entering my mid 30s now, and um, I think I just really feel the enormous importance of really dedicating myself to the practice. Um, because if we take our vows that we've made seriously to practice hard and awaken for the benefit of all sentient beings and help other beings to awaken to their own deep qualities of compassion and wisdom, it's never been a more important time to take that really seriously and to really dive in as deeply as we can. And so I've really been trying to, I've gone through phases like many of us do of like discipline, not so much discipline, like, you know, but recently I've really felt like spurred and inspired to practice every day, twice a day if I can. And that's not to brag, like I will, get
Okay,
distracted
okay,
sometimes,
John.
but okay. Like he's so good.
Okay.
But um but yeah, I just feel like I really need to um yeah, really, really practice like my hair's on fire kind of
Yes.
thing.
Oh man, couldn't agree
And
more.
Yeah, definitely. And so recently I've been doing a lot of practice around um, Tara, who some listeners might be familiar with. Tara as like the Buddha, the mother of the Buddhas, the Buddha, female Buddha who embodies protection and enlightened action of beings. And so praying to Tara and trying to embody the qualities of Tara to give refuge to beings who are fearful and suffering,
Mm,
it feels very important to me right now. And shout out to Tara's Triple Excellence. There's a program called Tara's Triple Excellence. If anyone's interested in learning more, look it up. Highly recommend.
totally.
Uh, yeah. And I think that's naturally just as you were saying, sort of like these karmic webs of causality we meet who we're supposed to meet, I found that this sort of practice really deepening my relationships with others in very unexpected and very rich ways right now. And also that's felt never more important than right now. Yeah.
Well said,
Hmm.
man. Yeah, I couldn't agree
Yeah.
more.
How's your practice going these days?
Oh, I also have been feeling like my hair's on fire. And again, it's not like,
Hmm.
oh my God, it's like, but it's really the sense of like, if not now, when? Like
Hmm.
the world is on fire, and
Hmm.
not in like a general, like the Buddha was known to once say that like the world is on fire. It's like, yeah, bro, but like not like this. Like the world is on
Hmm.
fire. There are weapons of mass destruction. AI is coming along. You got drones and facial recognition. You got murders on the street everywhere. You have racial
Hmm.
tension. Like if ever there was a time to take seriously our Dharma practice, to take seriously the responsibility we have to cultivate our minds and to take responsibility for like the little patch of universe that we have. Now
Hmm.
is that time. And I think a few things really motivate that. Like being a dad motivates that, knowing that like I'm not going to be here much longer, but my kiddo is, and like what kind of world do I want him to grow up in, has been a
Hmm.
huge motivator. And for me, this channel, this conversation that we're having, is actually like a huge kind of like outcrop of that feeling of my hair being on fire. Of like, you know, you talk about the triple excellence. We talk about Madhyamaka and the middle way. We talk about all these Rinpoches, and we talk about, you talk about the Shin Buddhists and their communities. Like you talk about the Black American Buddhist practitioners. Like there is it's so important to me right now that we elevate the voices and the awareness of not just Buddhist practice, like that's your and my perspective, but the importance of practice generally, right? Like if you're a Christian, like
Hmm.
pray and practice the kindness of Jesus. If everybody needs to really practice whatever it is that they're practicing more than ever, because it feels a little bit like we're like the bus is just kind of leaning off the precipice, and it's going to
Hmm.
be some kind of net where we're all holding hands together. That's the only thing that's going to keep it from careening into a situation where we lose what our teachers will refer to as our precious human life. And that's
Hmm.
something that our teachers talk about all the time is like, guys, it is really hard to gain a
Hmm.
human life, and it is really easy to lose it. Like, how many world systems exist? How many types of sentient being could you be? That you are here on this planet, that you actually have a chance to become aware of yourself and to cultivate your mind. It is extremely precious. And this is something I've heard Rinpoche talk about all the time. He's like, guys, like, we really should think about preserving this human birth because um, if things go well, we're here for millions and millions of years,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
it's like practice for me. And you talked about lineage, and I want to have future conversations where we talk about it. But lineage is the point at which like I can allow myself to relax into being like a dot, a chain in that link. That if you look
Hmm.
forward, it's just like, yep, over and over millions and millions of like, it doesn't really end. And if you look back, it also connects you. It kind of stabilizes your individuated experience in something larger than yourself. And I think it's just like more important than ever. I'm still trying to get to
Hmm.
the consistent see, I'm just waxing poetic. I'm procrastinating, dude, to tell you that I have not been hitting my evening practices as much as I want, but I have been taking it very seriously, my morning practices, and when I can, an evening practice. But like I said, practice can look like a lot of different things, and this channel, this
Totally.
conversation is part of that.
That's totally true. And I think, yeah, I really like how you brought up the the idea of, even beyond Buddhist practice, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, often I've heard him say, like, if you're a Muslim or you're a Christian or you're a Jew or Hindu, like, just be a good one of that. You don't have to become Buddhist. Just like go deep, be a good Christian, be a good Muslim, and that'll get you most of the way. And we need that in the world we're in now. Find some grounding, some base, and be a good one of that, and go deep into it. And and realizing that we're not alone in that because of lineage,
Mm,
because there
mm,
have been many, many generations of people who are still in the background for us, who are supporting us as we go along the path here, even in the midst of the horrifying times that we're in.
mm,
So, you know,
mm.
something for us to take refuge in, I guess, take some comfort in. Yeah, definitely.
Like eight new topics of conversation right there at the end. We'll save it for another
Indeed.
time.
Always
Um,
goes like that.
what would you say, just in closing for today, like how would you encourage, what would you recommend for somebody who does want to deepen their practice, whatever that looks like in today's world? How do we actually do that? How does a person
Mm,
actually practice?
that's a good question. I think one of the most important things is community.
Mm,
And, in Buddhism, we talk about Sangha, the community, as one of our refuges. And I think that's the case no matter what your tradition is. And so
mm,
finding community around the area of practice you're interested in, whether that's like a community in your city or your town or online, there's a lot of places online now where you can do Zoom practices, Zoom community gatherings, Zoom meditations. That's one of the silver linings of the pandemic, I guess, is the more infrastructure around that online. Um, and I also think finding some kind of teacher, whatever tradition you're in, realizing that you don't have to do this alone. And it's often not advisable to just kind of go through the steps alone. And
wing it.
it's exactly,
Just wing it.
exactly. Yeah, it's true. It can be fun to wing it, but also get you down some weird rabbit holes. And then before you know it, you're like some incel or something, or I
Starting
don't
a
know.
cult.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I think finding a teacher who has some kind of lineage behind them, like we're saying, who has their own teachers and their own community they're part of to keep them accountable and to that they draw on for wisdom, I think is really important. And whatever that looks like for you, I think you can discern what that means in a lot of different ways, even like a wise uncle in whatever community space you're in or in your family or but someone like that. And in other conversations, we can go into Buddhist specific resources or other resources too. But I think those are like the two starting points I would sort of go into in a general sense. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Hmm.
Thank you so much, man. Like I said, my secret, not so secret ploy is to have you on the show so many more times. But I
Happy
so
to.
enjoyed this conversation. I'm so grateful for you. I'm so grateful for your practice and everything you do to help other people practice across any lineage that they belong to. Thank you, man.
No, thank you. You're doing an enormous service as well in your work and even just this sort of channel. I think we need more things like this in the world right now. So keep it up. Looking forward to more conversations. Yeah,
Thank you, man.
definitely.